modalidades de turismo, como el turismo de salud y el ecoturismo, al tiempo que nosotros diversificamos la oferta inmobiliaria y de servicios, como parques de aventura, centros comerciales y también gastronómicos. A través de estrategias compartidas y de hermandad, podemos nosotros impulsar un turismo sostenible que pueda proteger nuestros recursos naturales, porque el turismo no solo genera crecimiento económico, sino que es una herramienta clave en lo que es la lucha contra el cambio climático y la preservación de nuestros ecosistemas. Al integrar prácticas sostenibles, no solo nosotros protegemos lo que es la belleza natural de nuestros países, sino que también nosotros aseguramos que las futuras generaciones puedan disfrutar de estos recursos en todos los espacios turísticos de África y de las Américas. Para ello, debemos seguir fortaleciendo nuestra colaboración interregional, desde lo que es la creación de redes de capacitación hasta lo que es la implementación de políticas comunes para el desarrollo del turismo responsable. Nuestro éxito dependerá de nuestra capacidad para trabajar juntos, y es que nuestra visión conjunta nos exige un profundo compromiso, pero también mucha responsabilidad compartida de construir puentes de hermandad, de cooperación, pero también de buena voluntad en el Atlántico a través de la cooperación sur-sur, utilizando el turismo como una herramienta de unión que se refleja en cada compromiso asumido en esta cumbre. El turismo es un agente de cambio, un catalizador para la paz y una fuente llena de oportunidades para nuestros pueblos. Sigamos aprovechando estos espacios para poder continuar colaborando, compartiendo nuestras mejores prácticas y enfrentando juntos los grandes desafíos globales. Este es solo el principio de una cooperación interregional que estoy segura va a garantizar el crecimiento económico, la preservación y enaltecer la belleza, pero también la identidad cultural de África y de las Américas. Hoy cerramos esta cumbre con la certeza de que sus resultados traerán un futuro de crecimiento, de inclusión, pero también de prosperidad para todos. Este futuro comienza hoy, con cada uno de nosotros. Muchísimas gracias, que Dios los bendiga y feliz estadía en la República Dominicana.
Agradecemos las palabras de la excelentísima vicepresidenta constitucional de la República Dominicana, señora Raquel Peña. Muchísimas gracias por su hospitalidad y también por su visión junto al gobierno de la República Dominicana del turismo para las Américas, para el Caribe y para África. A continuación, pedimos por favor que nos acompañe en este escenario el ministro de Turismo de la República Dominicana y presidente de la Comisión Regional para las Américas, señor David Collado, así como también el secretario general de la ONU Turismo, señor Surab Polo Likashvili, quienes se hacen acompañar en este momento del señor Juan Trinidad, quien es escultor dominicano, para proceder en este momento a develar la pieza de escultura que nuestro escultor dominicano otorga junto al gobierno de la República Dominicana para ONU Turismo. De esta manera, señoras y señores, procedemos a la develación de esta obra escultural que podremos presenciar en las instalaciones de la sede de ONU Turismo en Madrid. Con el aplauso de todos los presentes, señoras y señores, esta pieza escultórica de la autoría de Juan Trinidad, escultor dominicano destacado y radicado en Bonao, Monseñor Noel, República Dominicana. Aplauso nuevamente, señoras y señores. Agradecidos del arte y también de los buenos deseos del señor Juan Trinidad para compartir esta escultura que podremos disfrutar, nuevamente comparto, en la sede de ONU Turismo en la ciudad de Madrid, España. Presenciemos un audiovisual de esta pieza.
Yo me atrevo a decir que la obra de Juan Trinidad tiene influencia cubista. Y es interesante que sea cubista. Recordemos que el paradigma y una de las obras más importantes del siglo XX y el paradigma del cubismo es Las señoritas de Aviñón de Pablo Picasso, la Damoiselle de Aviñón de 1907. Pero cuando contemplamos esa obra, nos damos cuenta que las dos mujeres que están a la derecha, más que ser mujeres, parecen máscaras africanas. O sea, hay una influencia fuerte y poderosa en el cubismo del arte africano. Entonces yo lo veo en la obra de Juan Trinidad y la admiro esa obra porque yo respeto demasiado al escultor, sobre todo cuando talla. El 70% de la población de nuestro país es afrodescendiente. Tenemos que entender el peso que la afrodescendencia tiene para nosotros. Esa es la herencia de patrimonio inmaterial de la afrodescendencia para República Dominicana. Es un tema que nos concierne.
Encanto de la dominicanidad, de la autoría del escultor dominicano Juan Trinidad. Enhorabuena, señoras y señores, por este gesto que perpetúa el arte de la República Dominicana, evidentemente mezclando el Caribe, las Américas y África, que quedaría inmortalizado en la sede de ONU Turismo en Madrid, precisamente por motivo de esta primera cumbre África y Américas 2024. La prensa internacional y local aprovecha este momento para capturar algunas impresiones, así como también una fotografía que dejará inmortalizado este momento, en el cual en Punta Cana, República Dominicana, se celebra por primera vez en este espacio, este encuentro entre culturas, este encuentro que pone los ojos en el turismo sur-sur. Nos referimos a la primera cumbre África y América. De esta manera se retira la excelentísima señora Raquel Peña, vicepresidenta constitucional de la República Dominicana, quien ha hecho un espacio importante en su agenda para poder compartir en este encuentro de la primera cumbre África y América. La vicepresidenta de la República se retira para continuar con otros compromisos de su agenda. Sin embargo, aquí continuamos también la agenda común que tenemos preparados para todos ustedes en este Congreso de África y las Américas. Y seguimos con el siguiente punto de nuestra agenda, no sin antes invitar a cada uno de los participantes a que se acerquen nuevamente a sus asientos, que ocupen nuevamente sus espacios para poder dar continuidad al siguiente punto. Señoras y señores, la invitación es a acercarse a sus asientos para continuar con el siguiente punto de este Congreso. Abordados los puntos iniciales de esta agenda, señoras y señores, en este momento me permito dar paso al siguiente espacio y para ello me complace mucho poder introducir las palabras del vicepresidente regional de IATA, el señor Peter Cerdá, para que pronuncie su discurso que ha titulado Uniendo Continentes, impulsando los vínculos entre África y las Américas. Por favor, recibamos con un cálido aplauso al señor Peter Cerdá, vicepresidente regional de IATA.
Muchas gracias. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes a todos. Distinguished ministers, authorities, President, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your kind invitation today to UN Tourism. It is my pleasure to be here this afternoon to talk about the importance of air connectivity between Africa and the Americas. to unlock the economic growth and social development between both regions. In case you don't know who IATA is, we are the trade association for 83% of all international traffic around the world. Most of the airlines that are based in your countries are IATA members. And there's no better venue than being here in the Dominican Republic to talk about travel and tourism and how important it is and how important air travel is to travel and tourism and its development. When we look at it, air transportation is quite critical to our success in the travel and tourism world, particularly in regions like Latin America and Africa, where we don't have trains or big highways like in Europe or in North America. And how critical is air travel and tourism? And you can see here, it is quite critical to our different markets in our different regions. In Africa, close to 8 million jobs and $63 billion to the GDP contribution. In Latin America, 7.6 jobs and $18.3 billion to GDP. And it's been mentioned by many of you this morning on the cultural and historic closeness of Africa and America are deeply connected. However, we can't say the same thing about air connectivity, direct air connectivity. And many of you have had to come from Africa to Latin America via other continents to fly to this region. And when we look at how today 94% of the passengers from Africa coming to the Americas have to go through a different region. And in this case, most of them in today's world have to go through Europe. And this adds complexity, it adds cost, it adds time to travel. And when we look at the aspect of where we're going, while we may be taking some steps back in some occasions, in many cases we are actually moving forward. And we are moving in the right direction. Today, we have more connectivity between both regions than we did in any part of our history in the past. We have 46% more flights, and we have 61% more seats. And this is primarily when we look at the connections between Africa, mostly through North America, but we also see a large concentration of flights to Latin America. What we have to do in Latin America is expand it beyond just Brazil. But when you look at taking 2 steps forward with bringing more connectivity and more seats, what we are also seeing is in the last 14 years we've seen, or in the last decade, actually traffic between our 2 regions has actually gone down. And it's gone down by 35%. And when we look at it before the pandemic, we're still behind pre-pandemic times. So this is a moment for you between our continents to talk about how do we have more connections, more people traveling throughout our 2 regions. The industry, the air transportation industry, is bringing more flights to the regions on a direct way, but we actually have less people traveling on those flights. When we look at the top markets, as I mentioned, Brazil is the key point of entry from Africa into Brazil. And lately we've been very focused on countries like Argentina, where we've seen a government that's been very proactive in establishing new ties, open sky agreements. And that's a natural market that we would like to see in the future with more connectivity to other parts of the world. When we look at the continent of Africa, most of the transportation that's coming from Latin America into the region, most of the travelers are going into South Africa or Egypt. So certainly in both parts of the region, there's still significant work that can be achieved and attained to bring more traffic than our conventional entry and exit points that could be South Africa, Johannesburg, or Sao Paulo. So the question here, at least from my side to you, and as you discuss the future of air travel and tourism in our regions, between our regions, is why is connectivity so poor, and why haven't we even recovered from the pre-pandemic times? Well, one of it is the challenges of our sector, the aviation sector. And I want to show you how difficult of an environment it is for many of our airlines that are based in our respective regions. And let me start with the comparable of the North American carriers. The carriers from the US and Canada are the most profitable, most successful airlines in the world. And they will make about $13 per passenger in this year. When we look at the airlines based in Latin America, they will make about $1.90 this year for their profitability. And if we look at our African airlines, they will make a simply 90 cents per passenger. So when airlines have to decide where they want to connect and fly to, they have to look at the places where they will be able to maximize their aircraft and make the most money. And this is why when we look at strong global recovery, and we've seen 3 years of very strong recovery, many times we're talking about Europe to Africa, US to South America, but we're not talking about Africa to Latin America or Latin America to Africa, because that is not on the global stage of interest at this moment. And we have to change that mindset. And why do these airlines are still challenged in Africa or in Latin America? We also have to look at our macroeconomic and political situation in our regions. The social unrest, the challenges with the currencies, and social and political stabilities are still very volatile. So when airlines or companies want to invest and look at new markets, the challenge is, where do I go? Do I go to an environment that's going to be safe, or do I go to an environment that is volatile? The other challenge that we face as an industry, and you may have heard it from many aspects of your airline colleagues, is simply aircraft deliveries. We don't have enough airplanes to fly everywhere. And when we look at our respective regions in Africa and in Latin America, the vast majority of the airplanes that fly in our regions don't have the capability to fly across the Atlantic. So we have to see what more we can do. And it's not only about bringing new airplanes, but it's also making sure that the airplanes we have today are able to fly. And that is a big challenge because of what's happening with Boeing and Airbus and the different manufacturers. We also have to look at our airlines. Do they have the capabilities? When you look at the airlines from Latin America, for example, there are only 4 airlines that are capable of flying across the Atlantic. And when you look at their business models, the focus primarily is intra-regional with North America or into Europe, primarily into Spain. So how do the ministers of tourism in Africa gauge the airlines in Latin America to put airplanes into their region? And how do the ministers in Latin America attract airlines from Africa to operate into their markets? And one challenge that we have is, if you saw at the beginning in terms of connectivity, if you're in Africa, you're actually in most cases you're flying eastbound before you fly westbound, because when you look at Qatar, Emirates, or Turkish, most African citizens will actually fly backwards or eastbound to go westbound, and that's a challenge. In the in the Americas side, many passengers will actually have to fly into North America in order to fly into other parts of the world. And I think one of the representatives from Kenya said she flew into New York and then from New York to Dominican Republic. And that is the reality that we face in our respective regions. And that's what we have to overcome. But you as countries, as nations, do have the power and the influence to make change. In Latin America, I've heard throughout the last 3 or 4 years, not one single country in our region has talked about travel and tourism not being the #1 priority for their government, the #1 means of recovery economically and socially. Unfortunately, very few countries have actually lived by those words. And that's where we have to work much closer if we're going to stimulate more travel and tourism in our respective regions. Today, when you look at flying into Africa, fuel is 20% higher than the rest of the world. Now, we all know airplanes depend on a lot of fuel and they depend even more fuel when you're crossing these continents. And when you look at Latin America, it's the second highest region in terms of fuel. So you make it very, very difficult to make it a profitable or a business case that justifies to put an airplane between our two regions, because when you start looking at it, the costs are already building up. One thing I've been very much of an advocate in our part of the world in Latin America is the high taxes. I said this many times, and I apologize to my colleagues from this region when I think air travel is so critical to our different countries in Latin America. However, we're taxed like we are a vaca lechera, like a golden goose. And an example of and I use this quite a lot because it is the flavor of the month, my friends from Argentina. The size of Argentina from north to south is the distance between Lisbon and Moscow. That's how long the country is. And you look at Brazil, it's the size of Europe, continental Europe. You don't have high rail, you don't have highways, maritime doesn't exist, so it's air. But we make it very difficult on ourselves within the travel and tourism industry and working with governments to make air travel available to everyone. So when you have taxation, which is 44% in Latin America, and the rest of the world is at 27%, it makes it very difficult for our citizens in Africa or in Latin America to get on an airplane. And they become dependent on moving by roads or by buses. And last time I saw, if you want to get to Africa from Latin America or from Latin America to Africa, there's no way to get across except by ship, if not by air. So what do we have to do? What do we have to do to bring more connectivity to our respective markets? When we look at the next couple of years, actually, we have good news. Recovery is good. You look at 2025, 3.7% growth in Africa in terms of passenger numbers. That will grow to 5.4 in 2026 and slightly diminish to 4.7 in 2027, which is very similar to what we have in Latin America. So the numbers are improving. And when you look at long-term forecasting, look at our regions, how we will grow. In Latin America, you will have 300 million new passengers traveling by 2040. In Brazil, it is a country of 200 million people. Half of the population has ever been on an airplane. Our number one economy in the region, Brazil, half of its population has never flown. So we have significant opportunity. In Africa, you will have 170 million new passengers in the coming years. It is fantastic to have all of you here in Latin America, in the Dominican Republic, which has a rich culture and history on travel and tourism and creating the framework. But we have to come up with concrete actions. And how do we work to attract more connectivity? How do you convince more airlines to fly into your region on a more regular basis? And one is the government support. Our industry, air transport, depends on government partnership. It is essential. One of the representatives, ministers from Africa said, the issue about visas, we will not move forward as long as we continue to have the number of visa requirements that we have in place, both destination visas or in transit visas. And unfortunately, we're implementing more visa requirements rather than eliminating visa requirements. I'm from Spain, and beginning next year, Americans will be required to get a sort of type of visa request to come into the EU. So we are not making air travel any easier. We are not helping facilitate more tourism by implementing more requirements and more restrictions to travel between our countries. So it's something we have to work on. The other aspect is the bilateral agreements, open skies, and again, I give significant credit to the government of Argentina for the number of open skies and bilateral agreements that have taken place. They're the world champions in football, and they're certainly the world champions at this moment in terms of open skies and bilaterals. I've never seen a government sign more agreements than the government of Argentina, or any other government. I think they're up to 8. So felicidades al gobierno de Argentina, no solo en el fútbol, pero también en el tema de acuerdos bilaterales. The other aspect is the issue of partnership. And for many years, the industry, it's been somewhat of a love-hate relationship. Airlines want to fly to a country, but the relationship is sometimes cold and sour. And this is where we have to change that mindset, particularly within this sector. Travel and tourism is part of the ecosystem of air travel. Travel is part of that ecosystem. And we have to find ways of partnering. And we need you, who are within the government, to be our ambassadors within your government, with the ministries of economy, with the ministries of finance, and even with the heads of states, to make sure that we can continue to grow in that area. So collaborative tourism is critical, and that's going to be airline partnerships is critical, and governments have a significant say. Let me end on one last slide, and I think it's about, many of you are talking about how travel and tourism brings peace, brings harmony, trae ilusión, trae amor. But when we begin to see the number of people who actually are able to get on an airplane, are able to take a trip a year, and you look at our two respective regions, we have significant work to do. When you look at Latin America, 0.65 trips per year are taken on an average in Latin America. Less than 1 trip every 2 years. The situation is even more dire in Africa. An African will get on an airplane once every 10 years. In 2 regions, like I said at the beginning, that are highly dependent on air travel for survivability, to move commerce, to move people. In Latin America, we would have had many more deaths because of COVID if it wouldn't have been for air transportation. 96% of the vaccines that came into our region and went into the community went through air. Today, 90% of the travelers into Latin America fly by air. So this is why it's so critical, and I end with this slide, because this is the message we should be taking home on. We want to have more travel and tourism. We want to have more connection between our regions. But our own citizens in our own countries in this part of the world and in Africa are barely getting on an airplane, which means in many cases are barely leaving their communities to take any sort of vacation and holiday. So while we may want to have more close ties between our communities, our citizens are staying within their communities because they cannot afford to travel to other communities in other parts of the world. And I hope during the next few days you come around these and we have these conversations in order to attract more connectivity so we can bring more people from Africa to Latin America and from Latin America to Africa. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos al señor Peter Cerdá, quien es vicepresidente regional de IATA, por estas palabras que apuntan a unir continentes, impulsando los vínculos entre África y las Américas. Culminada esta ponencia, señoras y señores, quiero pedir por favor que nos acompañe en nuestra mesa de honor para la fotografía de familia. Es bueno puntualizar con cada uno de ustedes que tienen en sus manos un número que será la referencia para la colocación en nuestra foto de familia. Si son tan amables, tomar ese número para que puedan encontrar en esta escalera su posición a ocupar en nuestra fotografía de familia en esta cumbre de África y las Américas. En este momento, cada uno de nuestros participantes, miembros de nuestra mesa de honor, please come on over, our guests in this moment, our family photo. You all have a number in your hands that will help you to find your place in our family photo space. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The members of our honor table, if they please come on over to our family photo. All of you are invited to join us in the moment that we take this family photo. En este momento, señoras y señores, aprovechamos para hacer esta fotografía de familia que nos permitirá inmortalizar este momento tan especial de la primera cumbre África y Américas. Los miembros de nuestra mesa de honor se posicionan para poder capturar este momento que marca la historia de ONU Turismo. Con nuestra mejor sonrisa y, por supuesto, con la satisfacción del deber cumplido de esta jornada de trabajo, en el cual actores de diferentes regiones, sectores y disciplinas reconocen los desafíos que enfrentamos mutuamente y demuestran la voluntad de trabajar juntos para superar estos desafíos y también para establecer una cooperación productiva entre África y América Latina y el Caribe. Con el aplauso de todos los presentes, señoras y señores, un momento que queda para nuestra historia, una excelente jornada de trabajo en este día jueves y, por supuesto, terminado este momento de fotografía de familia, queremos invitar a todos nuestros invitados especiales a seguir al personal del hotel hacia el lugar del Lunchbox, aquí en el Hotel Paradisus Palmas Real Golf and Spa Resort, para disfrutar de un almuerzo con nuestros sabores caribeños que tanto pues nos llenan de orgullo. Después les invitamos a disfrutar de las instalaciones del hotel y participar en reuniones bilaterales, formales e informales, también para aprovechar al máximo este fantástico encuentro entre África y las Américas. Antes de retirarnos, por supuesto, recordar a todos los presentes que están invitados a la cena de gala de actuación culinaria y cultura afro-latinoamericana y del Caribe, que se llevará a cabo en el restaurante Alto Marina, en la Marina de Capcana, a las 20 horas, 8 de la noche de República, 10 de la noche, 8 de la noche de República Dominicana. Thank you to all of you.